Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable resilience of medieval peasants. People who endured plagues, wars, taxes, and of course famine, often all in the same week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene. You're a medieval peasant. Your name is probably something thrilling like Illid or Maud. You've got one shirt, one tooth, and one dream. That this year's barley harvest won't betray you like your cousin did at last year's sheep wrestling contest. But fate, and by fate we mean weather, pests, and the occasional Viking has other plans. It's year 2 of back-to-back crop failures. The wheat has gone on strike, the oats have eloped with mildew, and the only thing growing in your field is resentment. Famine in the medieval world wasn't rare. It was a seasonal guest, like taxes, but greyer and more bitey. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, swept across Europe like a very hungry fog. Torrential rains ruined crops, livestock drowned in their own pastures, and grain prices shot up faster than your neighbour's accusations of witchcraft. The first thing to go is bread. And when bread disappears, so does the illusion of stability. Grain was the cornerstone of the peasant diet, not because it was particularly delicious, but because it was relatively edible and less likely to bite back. So, what did you do when the granary echoed like a church on Monday morning? You improvised. It's late autumn and your last goat has mysteriously run away, except you found its leg boiling in your neighbour's stew pot. Coincidence? Unlikely. Welcome to famine logic, where anything with calories is either a meal or a suspect. In normal years, livestock were your wealth, your power, and your walking cheese dispensers. But in a famine year, they were last resort meals with names. Chickens gone, pigs roasted, sheep eaten down to the bell. You even eyed the ox, not for meat, but because ploughing fields was starting to feel optional compared to simply surviving until next week. And then the rats arrived. Actually, they were always there. But now they weren't just stealing grain, they were becoming grain. Peasants began setting traps, lighting torches and getting creative. Roast rat on a stick, rat broth, rat and turnip casserole. If it twitched and ran, it was now part of the protein pyramid. Even cats weren't safe. Fluffy, who once napped on your haystack, is now suspiciously missing, and the pot smells different. Desperation also meant peasants turned to things they wouldn't have touched in ordinary misery. Hedgehogs, crunchy, squirrels, gamey, frogs. Surprisingly posh if you ignore the screaming. And don't get us started on snails. The French call it escargot. Medieval peasants just called it Wednesday. Preservation became a dark art. Salting meat? You wish. Salt was too expensive. Smoking was more realistic if you had wood, a fire, and a reason to pretend you weren't crying into your bone stew. Some monasteries offered a lifeline. They had better food stores, and peasants might trade labour, loyalty, or just basic silence in exchange for a warm bowl. Others bartered wildly, offering eggs that didn't exist yet, or marrying off cousins to strangers who promised soup. And yes, in some records there's talk of cannibalism, but that was usually the next village over. Yours, of course, only considered it. Through it all, rumours travelled faster than carts. A pig spotted 2 miles away, a merchant with rye, a noble who might donate leftovers. Hope was measured in crumbs and gossip. And if you still had your dog, congratulations, you either had moral restraint or he was faster than you. First came the seed grain, the portion you were supposed to save for next season. A risky move, like eating your last chess piece in the middle of a losing game. But desperation doesn't do long-term planning. Next, you turn to substitutes. Barley bread became bark bread, literally. You'd grind tree bark into flour and mix it into dough, the texture like chewing through a really aggressive contract. Then came boiled weeds, acorns, and if things got truly dire, shoe leather stew. Not for the taste, more for the mouth activity. Some peasants tried begging in town, others stole. A few very ambitious ones even joined monasteries for the free soup and eternal guilt. Surviving a famine wasn't about thriving. It was about outlasting your neighbour. preferably the one who smelled like turnips and looked a bit too interested in your cat. Let's talk about bread, the humble loaf, the peasant's best friend, and occasionally its assassin. In a famine year, grain wasn't just scarce, it was dangerously weird. If you managed to find rye or wheat, chances were it had been sitting in a damp barn for months, maybe years. You didn't ask where it came from. You didn't ask why it was glowing slightly. You just thanked the heavens and tried to bake it before it walked away. Enter ergot, a fungus that loved damp rye. Medieval folks didn't know it by name, but they knew its effects. Muscle spasms, hallucinations, burning sensations, and the fun surprise of losing limbs like medieval Lego pieces. Ergot poisoning was known as St. Anthony's fire, because nothing says divine intervention like bread that sets your veins on fire. So yes, the one thing you were counting on not to betray you betrayed you. Again, the baking process didn't help. Peasants often used communal ovens, and in a famine year, the ovens were like confession booths of despair. You brought your weird flour, your tragic hopes, and you waited for something vaguely edible to emerge. What came out was usually dense, blackened, and about as inviting as a brick with abandonment issues. But it was bread, sort of, as long as it didn't twitch. Some desperate souls tried to stretch their dough with things that weren't food. Clay, chalk, ground bones, moss. The nutritional value was negligible, but it added that crunchy medieval texture everyone hated and feared. Children were the first to get sick, then the elderly, then the strong. Because famine doesn't discriminate, it just queues you up. Ironically, those with the worst bread fared slightly better. If your loaf was mostly bark and sorrow, it probably wasn't laced with poison, just splinters. People began looking for signs. If a neighbour started twitching mid-sentence or claimed the Virgin Mary told him to lick a turnip, you knew it was time to dump the bread and rethink dinner. In villages with priests, the line between sin and spoiled grain got blurry. Was it divine punishment or just bad baking? Either way, the bread you ate could fill you, sicken you, or kill you. Sometimes all three in one sitting. With the fields dead, the bread cursed, and the animals suspiciously absent, it was time to embrace the lifestyle of the forest gremlin. Welcome to Foraging Medieval Edition. No trendy baskets, no botanical guidebooks, just you, the woods, and a vague sense that this mushroom might be dinner or doom. Peasants knew their local landscape better than most modern GPS systems. Not out of hobby, but because they had to remember which plant made soup, and which one made your mouth froth like an angry goose. Trial and error was the unofficial curriculum, emphasis on error. Nettles were a popular option. Once boiled thoroughly and insulted into submission, they could be eaten without stinging you from the inside. Dandelion leaves, bitter but edible. Wild garlic, a luxury. It masked the scent of existential dread. Some folks turned to roots, bok, parsnips, and whatever they could pry from the dirt without alerting the local badgers. Mushrooms were trickier. One bite could either nourish you or send you on a vivid spiritual journey involving flaming goats and talking clouds. And there were no refunds. Berries, sure, if you wanted to play the annual game of is it poison or just very tart. A wrong guess meant your stomach staged a rebellion, and your soul took a walk. Tree bark was also back on the menu again. Elm bark could be ground into flour like powder. Pine needles made a kind of tea if you were into forest cosplay. Some even chewed on reeds and grass, which, let's be honest, is just sadness in plant form. Children were often sent to forage, not because they were good at it, but because they were small and could fit between thorn bushes. Also, if they didn't return, you knew not to eat whatever they picked. Local wise women, also known as unofficial botanists with suspiciously good teeth, were in high demand. Their knowledge of don't-die herbs often kept entire villages going. Of course, they were later accused of witchcraft because people have never been good at gratitude. Foraging wasn't glamorous. It was scratching survival from the margins. Every meal felt like gambling with nature, and nature usually had better cards. If the forest didn't feed you, and your bread tried to murder you, the next logical step was to turn to the greatest institution in medieval survival, community guilt and religious bargaining. Let's start with your neighbours. In normal times, you'd exchange gossip, maybe a chicken, maybe your cousin in marriage. In famine times, you traded anything, and I mean anything. A broken tool, a threadbare tunic, that weird goat-shaped rock you insist is lucky. If it bought you half a turnip, it was a win. The village turned into a bearing circus. I'll fix your roof if you give me soup. I'll watch your kids if you let me chew on that onion. Everything had value except money. Money was for lords. Peasants dealt in onions, favours and subtle threats. But when even the neighbours ran dry, the next option was divine intervention. Enter the church. Medieval churches were often the best-fed buildings in town. They had tithes, grain stores, wine cellars, and a suspiciously plump abbot. While you were gnawing bark, the monastery still had salted fish and wine because God apparently liked fermented luxury. So peasants did what peasants do best. They grovelled. You could pray, of course, but it helped if you also swept the floors, offered your last egg, or donated that one relic your uncle claimed was the real finger of St. Jerome. It wasn't. It was a chicken bone. But shh, in return you might get a bowl of soup, or if lucky, bread without hallucinations. The clergy knew famine made people pious, and nothing filled pews faster than empty stomachs. Wills were rewritten. People donated land to the church in exchange for blessings and maybe lunch. Some folks joined monastic life outright because starvation is slightly less awful when there's porridge and chanting, but not all clergy were generous. Some just told you to fast and trust in divine mercy, which is a nice way of saying, good luck with that, peasant. Still, churches became unofficial aid stations. A sermon, a wafer, and a reminder that starving now meant feasting later in heaven, hopefully. When the fields failed, the forest ran dry and the church soup became increasingly hypothetical. Peasants were left with only one option. Walk. Just pick up and leave. Pack your kids, your goat, and that one pot that hadn't cracked from sorrow, and go find food somewhere. Anywhere. Medieval peasants weren't known for wanderlust. Most people were born, married and died within walking distance of the same dung heap. But famine rewrote the rules. Suddenly that suspicious rumour from the next valley. I heard they still have oats in Dunic became a beacon of hope, or at least something better than chewing your belt again. So, off they went. It wasn't glamorous. There were no caravans with upbeat music and matching cloaks, just gaunt families trudging down muddy paths, dodging wolves and local barons, and hoping to find a village that hadn't already eaten its cats. Some nobles tried to stop the wandering, not out of concern, but because empty fields meant no one was around to pay taxes or die in the next pointless skirmish. So vagrancy laws were introduced. Translation, you're not starving the correct way. Go home and do it properly. Others welcomed refugees, especially lords who had land but no labour. If you had strong arms and didn't look too plaguey, you might score a spot in someone else's thief. The interview process was simple. Can you swing a scythe? Can you dig? Will you eat rats without complaining? Great. Welcome to the team. But moving was risky. You didn't know the customs, the dialect, or whether the local priest thought your accent was demonic. Many ended up in towns which were like modern cities, except louder, filthier, and more on fire. At least there, begging was a viable career. Some gave up entirely and became outlaws, poachers, or roadside prophets, shouting about divine turnips and wheat miracles. Famine was a great equalizer. Everyone was equally desperate, equally filthy, and equally suspicious of that beef stew with no cows in sight. In the end, mobility was a last resort, a gamble. You either found a new life, or just a different place to starve slightly more stylishly. By month 6 of a famine, the term food begins to lose meaning. You've already eaten the bread, the porridge, the goat, arip bleety, and probably your pride. What's left is what historians politely call famine foods, and what medieval peasants probably called simply Tuesday. Let's start with tree bark. Again, it comes up a lot. People weren't munching on logs like beavers. They'd peel the inner layer called the cambium, dry it, grind it, and mix it with whatever passed for flour. The result? Bark bread, which sounds like a hipster cafe special, but tastes like mulch wrapped in desperation. Then there were grass cakes. No, not the herbal kind your cousin smokes. Literal ground-up weeds, moss, or even straw mashed with water and dried in the sun. It had the texture of regret and the nutritional value of a sock. But hey, chewing something is better than chewing nothing. Leather. Fair game. Old boots, belts, harnesses, Boiled long enough, they became chewy, salty, and mostly non-lethal. Medieval stew recipes didn't always clarify animal product, so if it held a buckle at one point, into the pot it went. Cats, dogs, and rats. Let's just say famine wasn't a great time to be a household pet. Rats, in particular, became a delicacy. Easy to catch, easy to roast, and if you squinted hard enough, you could pretend it was chicken or at least not rat. People also got creative with bones. You could boil them for hours to make broth. If you'd already boiled them last week, you boiled them again. Bone broth became bone tea, became bone sadness. Worst of all were the ergot-infected grains. They looked normal, rye or wheat, but carried a lovely hallucinogenic fungus. Symptoms included vomiting, gangrene, and sometimes dancing until you died. Not ideal, but hey, some villagers appreciated the entertainment. And then there were miracle foods. Roots that made you vomit but not die. Lichens that vaguely resembled cheese. And if you were really lucky, a single surviving apple that hadn't fermented into an alcoholic wasp hotel. In short, the medieval menu during famine was an ever-shrinking roulette of, will this kill me? With a side of probably. Famine wasn't just a bad time to eat, it was also a bad time to die. Unfortunately, a lot of people did, slowly and painfully. Medieval peasants had a complicated relationship with death. On the one hand, it was ever-present. On the other, famine made it especially clingy. Burials became quick and communal, not out of noble solidarity, but because no one had the calories to spare for solo graves. Last rites were rushed, confessions trimmed to 30-second slots, and grieving parents often reused names of dead children as a grim practicality. Death could even bring strange relief, as one less mouth to feed sometimes outweighed sorrow. Morality bent under starvation, and peasants found therapy in art like the danse macabre. Skeletons joyfully dancing because if death was inevitable, why not picture him doing the worm? Some peasants managed to linger through famine like skeletal survivors with cockroach-level willpower, having already outlived plagues, lords, and even cow rebellions. But famine didn't just flatten fields, it shook up the social pyramid. Lords rarely grew humble. Many flaunted wealth with banquets of venison and music while their peasants starved, though a few rare nobles tried to help with arms or grain imports. Clergy and monasteries sometimes opened food stores, but also used famine as leverage, urging peasants to donate land for extra prayers. Villagers, desperate for survival, begged, bartered, or occasionally revolted. Revolts rarely succeeded, but at least they offered cardio and new dungeon scenery. Famine also bred suspicion. Anyone looking a bit plump was accused of hoarding, witchcraft, or worse, being secretly French. The marriage market shifted too, with families rushing to marry off children before famine claimed them. Dowries shrank to half a sack of oats, and maybe a haunted spoon. Still, peasants found ways to resist despair. Secret foraging parties, shared meals of mystery stew, and graffiti like, Sir Geoffrey is a donkey carved into barns. Yet famine gnawed not only on bodies but on minds. With no therapists or scented candles, peasants turned to faith, superstition, or scapegoating. Some begged heaven with endless masses and candles, while others blamed women, foreigners, or neighbours who smiled too much. Rituals became desperate. If you couldn't sacrifice a chicken for rain, you just shouted at the sky, and when that failed, blamed your neighbour for not shouting loud enough. Starvation twisted dreams and humour alike. Diets of grass and regret fueled visions of saints, demons, or cows promising milk that never arrived. Waking often felt worse than sleep. Gallows humour filled the gaps. Wives' stews were joked about as deadly, until one really was. Children invented famine games like Count the Ribs, Is That Edible? And hide and seek from debt collectors. Even art took on dark absurdity, with manuscript doodles of dancing skeletons, vomiting peasants, or nuns sword-fighting snails. Subtlety was not the Middle Ages' strong point, but humour and absurdity became survival strategies when food could not. And yet, somehow, peasants endured. Despite moss soup dinners, starvation games, and funerals without tears, people carried on. Famine rarely sparked innovation, unless you count figuring out how to make bark bread or moss stew as culinary progress. Still, starvation forced adaptations. discovering new foods, bending rituals, and coping through humour or superstition. Humans have an irritating talent for survival, and medieval peasants embodied it. Even when their stomachs were empty and their bedtime stories were death tolls, they found a way to keep going. Famine years brought unexpected changes like better composting and crop rotation. Peasants discovered that beans after barley meant fewer deaths, even if they didn't understand nutrient cycles. Wild plants, berries, rye, millet, and spelt returned to diets when wheat failed. Preservation also advanced. Salting, drying, and smoking stretched supplies, and buried cheese developed a rind and a personality. Communal labour grew stronger, with shared ovens and fragile bread alliances, while villages improved granaries to keep out moisture and rats. Oral traditions flourished, passing knowledge of edible plants and dangerous mushrooms from one generation to the next. When food finally returned, it felt less like celebration and more like cautiously dating an ex. First came disbelief, then superstition, then desperate acceptance. Harvest was treated as holy, and families wept over loaves after months of surviving on bark and sarcasm. Children born during the famine tasted bread for the first time, sometimes with weevils. Trust, however, did not return easily. People hoarded scraps in walls or buried peas behind barns, and one man famously kept an onion under his bed. Some lords created grain reserves, while others simply raised taxes again, assuming survival meant peasants were secretly rich. Still, renewed food brought hope, healthier babies, jokes, and even cautious experiments in fashion, brown but hopeful brown. After famine, storytelling preserved memory and knowledge. Elders exaggerated survival feats, living in trees, eating hats, or fighting wolves with dry bread, while children played famine games like begging for turnips or collapsing dramatically. These tales had purpose, teaching which weeds, mushrooms, and lords to avoid. They built community, with jokes about flatulence, mouldy bread, and Uncle Jeff's infamous thistle pie. Songs emerged, lamenting empty granaries and greedy landlords, ensuring memories survived. Humour softened trauma, but stories also prepared villages for the next famine, which inevitably came. Even Brother Thomas milking a goose became a remembered lesson in absurd survival. Yet famine meant death too. Burial grounds filled, forcing shallow graves sometimes dug with wooden spoons. Funerals shrank to quick prayers, and mourning was brief, squeezed between hunger and planting. Families wore ashes or ribbons as symbols of grief, while makeshift memorials, crosses, carvings, rings on branches, offered dignity. Children played at funerals with straw dolls, a coping mechanism in a grim world. Priests, overwhelmed, phoned in blessings after their 17th funeral in a week. Still, stories of courage endured, of peasants giving away final crusts of bread. Even when famine passed, grass grew over graves, but memories lingered, ensuring no one was completely forgotten. Surviving famine changed trust itself. Peasants realised lords and abbots had food while they starved, fueling resentment. Whispers spread. They starved us on purpose. Uprisings broke out, with peasants armed with pitchforks, hoes, and rage. Granaries were raided, markets disrupted, and occasionally nobles locked in their own wine cellars. Most revolts were crushed. Donkeys don't outrun knights, but fear lingered. Lords built sturdier locks and higher towers, while wiser monarchs regulated grain and built emergency stores. Even laws softened, forgiving thefts committed during famine years, because everyone remembered mercy had starved alongside justice. And so, famine survival was built on desperation, ingenuity, blind luck, and the courage to resist. Humans endured by composting better, boiling moss into soup, inventing jokes, and sharing knowledge. They also endured by remembering, through stories, graves, rebellions, and bitter laughter. And when famine ended, peasants rebuilt not just their diets, but their resolve. From compost heaps to whispered songs, they carried lessons into the next crisis. Because survival wasn't just about eating, it was about refusing to forget. In April 1567, Bothwell stood trial for Darnley's murder, but the proceedings were a farce, rushed, witness intimidation rampant, and Bothwell acquitted. Within weeks, He shocked Scotland by marrying Mary, Queen of Scots. Whether she went willingly or was coerced remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Some accounts suggest he abducted her. Others argue Mary, desperate for strength, chose him. Either way, the marriage was catastrophic. Nobles, already suspicious of her after Darnley's death, rebelled. At Carberry Hill, Mary's supporters deserted her, forcing her surrender, while Bothwell fled. Imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle, she was stripped of her crown in favour of her infant son James, with her half-brother ruling as regent. In May 1568, Mary escaped Loch Leven with loyal help, disguised herself, and rallied supporters. For a moment, fortune turned. An army rose to reclaim her throne. Yet, at Langside, her forces were crushed, forcing her into a desperate choice. Instead of fleeing to France, she crossed into England seeking refuge with her cousin Elizabeth I. Elizabeth faced a dilemma. Mary was both kin and a Catholic claimant whose legitimacy many in Europe considered stronger. Shelter meant danger, rejection meant betrayal. Elizabeth chose protective custody, which quickly became house arrest. For 19 years, Mary was shuttled between great houses, her movements restricted, but her dignity intact. Mary never accepted defeat. She corresponded secretly with Catholic allies abroad, used coded letters smuggled in beer barrels and cloth, and imagined Elizabeth would one day grant her justice. To Catholic Europe she remained a beacon, Elizabeth a Protestant queen, Mary a Catholic royal with strong Tudor blood. Conspiracies flourished, the Ridolfi plot in 1571, the Throckmorton plot in 1583, and ultimately the Babington plot in 1586, which sought Elizabeth's assassination. Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, intercepted ciphered letters that implicated Mary. Whether she truly approved Elizabeth's murder is debated, but to her enemies the evidence was damning. Elizabeth had resisted executing her cousin for nearly 2 decades, but with Parliament pressing, she relented. In October 1586, Mary was tried at Fotheringhay Castle for treason. She argued she owed no allegiance to Elizabeth and thus could not be guilty of treason, but the court dismissed her defence. With remarkable courage, she reminded her judges that she was a sovereign, not a subject, declaring, "The theatre of the whole world is wider than the kingdom of England." Found guilty, she was sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated but finally signed the warrant. On February 8, 1587, Mary faced execution at Fotheringhay. Dressed in black, with crimson beneath as the colour of martyrdom, she prayed for her son and forgave her executioners. The first axe stroke was clumsy, the second struck deeper, and with the third her life ended at age 44. Her death shocked Europe. Catholics hailed her a martyr, Protestants a cautionary tale. Ironically, her son James VI of Scotland would inherit Elizabeth's throne as James I of England, uniting the crowns she had so long sought. After Mary's fall, the story turns to the daily survival of her people. In medieval Scotland, oats defined the diet. Thriving in harsh climates where wheat failed, oats became bread, porridge, bannocks, and broth. Foods that sustained peasants, nobles, monks, and soldiers alike. Bannocks cooked on girdles anchored hearth and ritual, while porridge stirred with a spurtle fed generations from cradle to grave. Broth stretched scraps of meat, kale, and herbs into communal meals, often a perpetual stew. The sea added salted herring, vital for protein preservation and trade, especially under church fasting rules. Oats and herring symbolised resilience, forming the backbone of survival in Scotland, a humble but enduring testament to strength. Muslim defenders and civilians alike were cut down in alleys and markets. Even livestock was slaughtered in the frenzy. The cries of the dying mingled with the chants of crusaders who believed they were cleansing the city for God. Yet amidst the carnage, symbolism guided their steps. Crusaders rushed to the church of the Holy Sephilah, where they fell to their knees praying and weeping in gratitude. For them the massacre was not mere butchery but the purging of Jerusalem, reclaiming it for Christendom after centuries of Islamic rule. In their eyes, blood was the price of sanctity. For the wider Muslim world, the massacre became a wound that never healed. news of the slaughter spread quickly across the Middle East, shocking rulers and commoners alike. Jerusalem, revered as the third holiest city in Islam, had not just been captured, but defiled. The brutality seared itself into memory, fueling a cycle of vengeance that would dominate the centuries to come. In victory, the Crusaders believed they had fulfilled God's will, but their triumph was stained in rivers of blood, and the massacre of 1099 would echo as one of the darkest chapters in the long struggle for the Holy City. In the days after Jerusalem fell, the chaos slowly gave way to order, at least from the perspective of the conquerors. The slaughter had left the city eerily silent, its streets littered with corpses, and its wells and systems choked with blood. But to the Crusaders, this was a holy cleansing. They believed they had delivered Jerusalem back into the hands of Christendom. And now the question loomed, how should it be ruled? The first step was sanctification. Barefoot Crusaders processed to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, washing its floors and rededicating it to Christian worship. Priests celebrated Mass over the very site they believed marked Christ's tomb. Relics were raised high, and hymns echoed through walls still scarred by battle. For the victors, this was the climax of their pilgrimage, proof that their sacrifices had been blessed by God. But politics quickly followed piety. With Jerusalem conquered, leadership had to be settled. Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest and most ambitious lords, refused the crown, claiming he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn one of thorns. The mantle then passed to Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted the role, but styled himself not king but advocate of the Holy Sailor. His title reflected both humility and strategy. Jerusalem was to be seen not as a secular kingdom, but as the earthly stronghold of Christendom itself. Under this new Latin rule, Jerusalem was reshaped. Mosques were converted into churches, Islamic sacred spaces stripped of their treasures, and new laws enforced. The city became the heart of the Crusader states, a Latin Christian enclave carved into the Muslim world. Pilgrims from Europe now had a destination secured by knights, and the Crusaders began fortifying their conquest, aware that Muslim powers would not leave the loss unchallenged for long. Yet beneath the triumph lay fragility. The Crusader garrison was small, resources were thin, and enemies surrounded them. The Fatimid Caliphate to the south and the Seljuk Turks to the east both viewed Jerusalem's fall as intolerable. Though the city now bore the cross upon its towers, it would remain under constant threat. The establishment of Crusader rule was not the end of the struggle for Jerusalem, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that would define the relationship between Christian and Muslim powers for generations. The capture of Jerusalem in July 1099 was more than a military victory. It was an event that reshaped the medieval world. For the Crusaders, it was the fulfillment of a divine mission. After 3 brutal years of marching, starving and fighting, they had seized the holiest city in Christendom. Chroniclers in Europe hailed them as heroes, their triumph celebrated in churches from Rome to Paris. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond expectation, proving that Christendom could unite and achieve what seemed impossible. But to the Muslim world, the siege was a catastrophe. News of the massacre spread swiftly across Egypt, Syria and beyond. Jerusalem, sacred to Islam as the site of the Prophet's night journey, had been bathed in blood. For many Muslims, the loss was both a humiliation and a call to arms. The memory of 1099 became a rallying point for resistance, shaping leaders like Zini, Nur ad-Din, and ultimately Saladin, who would vow to restore the city to Islamic rule. For the Jewish communities of Jerusalem, the siege was an unspeakable tragedy. Many were slaughtered in the synagogue fires or hunted in the chaos, and survivors carried tales of horror into exile. Their suffering became another scar in the long story of persecution that marked Jewish life in the medieval world. Politically, the conquest created something new, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. With Godfrey of Bouillon as its first ruler, the city became the capital of the Crusader states, fragile outposts of western Christendom in the heart of the Middle East. Castles rose on the hills, knights garrisoned the roads, and pilgrims began streaming toward the Holy Sepulchre under the protection of their fellow Christians. Yet the kingdom was always precarious, surrounded by hostile powers and dependent on reinforcements from Europe. Culturally, the siege hardened attitudes on both sides. In Europe, Tales of miraculous victories fueled the idea that God's hand guided the Crusades. In the Islamic world, the massacre of Jerusalem burned into collective memory as a crime demanding vengeance. The clash of faiths became more than territorial. It was spiritual, existential, and destined to last for centuries. The siege of 1099 was not just the bloody capture of a city, it was the spark that ignited 200 years of crusades, a cycle of holy war and reprisal that would scar the medieval world. Jerusalem had been taken, but peace had been lost. Its stones still bore the weight of both victory and vengeance.